Hello third year historians, and welcome to our next lesson in our slave trade topic, which is our National 5 topic. This lesson is continuing on looking at the impacts of the slave trade on various places. We've now looked at the impact of the slave trade on Africa, and we've looked at the impact of the slave trade on the West Indies. So we're now going to move to the final part of the triangular trade route, which is Britain, and think about the impact that the slave trade had there. This lesson is going to be split into two different sides. This is the first one because when we're thinking about how the impact of the slave trade on Britain actually was, we're talking about real benefits for Britain. The slave trade was absolutely fantastic for Britain. It gave them a lot more than any other place. There was some negative elements in terms of racist attitudes and things like that, certainly, but most of what we're talking about is definitely positive. So we're talking about how the slave trade benefited Britain, and we're talking about these in very different ways. So Britain gained quite a lot from the slave trade in a very general way, which we're going to come back to in the next lesson. But for this lesson, we're thinking about the specific cities and the ports that gained so much from being involved in the trade themselves. So this lesson is about the impact of the slave trade on the British cities. The whole point of this lesson is going to be to describe how the British ports benefited from the slave trade, what things each of these ports actually got, looking at this in a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about the slave ports, we're talking about these four: London, Liverpool, Bristol, and sometimes we talk about it being Glasgow as well. When we think about why these areas, it's probably because these ones are the ones that are near the coastal areas. They're also kind of the industrial areas of Britain as well. Glasgow we know more about in more modern day, whereas London, Liverpool and Bristol were seen as the slave ports mostly used by Britain and people coming into that part of European trade. So these areas are particularly the ones we're looking at because these are the port areas where the slave ships would leave from, and then the other ships with the goods would return to. Now, it is not that the slaves were brought to Britain. Remember, the slaves go from Africa across the Middle Passage to the West Indies, and they are traded there for goods. And quite often what would happen is another ship that belonged to the same company would be waiting in the West Indies to take the goods that the slaves had been sold for, or the money that had been gotten from the slaves were used to buy the goods, and they would take them back and forward to the ports that they left off from. The slave ship itself, the one that actually carried the slaves, would return to its base port, so it might be from Liverpool, say for example. It would then completely clean out, it would restock with all the stuff that they traded in Africa, and that would then head back to Africa to pick up the slaves again, back along the Middle Passage and do the trade route, and then again like this. Meanwhile, ship number 2 would be going up and down until they'd managed to get all of the goods that they were entitled to and sold these back in Britain. So the slaves didn't come and be auctioned in Britain in any of these places, and that is really key to keep in mind. So, slave ship merchants made roughly about £12 million worth of profit between 1630 and 1807 when the slave trade ended. The money that they actually made helped make thousands of jobs, it helped to kickstart the Industrial Revolution, it helped to shape Britain as we know it today. The 4 major cities that benefited from the slave trade in Britain are Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool and London, like we said. Each of these cities grew from the benefits of the slave trade as industry increased, specifically manufacturing and shipbuilding, which led to an increase in wealth to these areas. The 4 main ways that they grew are outlined below, and we've got them bullet pointed here. The slave ships carrying cargo to the main ports created jobs in shipping and shipbuilding, created the ports as well. The cargo was being sold, which created wealth. Profits in London led to banking and insurance industries growing. Industry was financed and cargo was transported to these industrial towns for manufacturing, which created jobs in places like factories, and the manufactured goods were then sent back to the ports to be traded for slaves, which then meant that the slave trade actually continued on. Who benefited from this? Pretty much everybody. Why did Britain ultimately benefit? The wealthy merchants who made their money in slavery used it for investments. Some invested in banks, others invested in new growing companies like Lloyd's of London at this point in time, others invested it in engineering companies or the cotton industry. So Britain benefited because the money that was being made on the slaves' produce, the things that they grew and were being sold, or on the slaves being sold themselves, were being used to reinvest back in Britain. Other people took their money and built huge country estates like this one. Other ones like these ones you can see pictured here, West Wycombe House in Buckinghamshire, which is built off of slave money, very opulent buildings. Others bought influence in Parliament, so they bought themselves a position as an MP, which you could do at that point in time because they had then wealth behind them. This gave them influence and things on politics. These investments created jobs and they turned small fishing ports into important trading centres. The British government benefited hugely from the slave trade. In 1770 alone, they made £1.5 million from taxes in just Jamaica, which meant they were then able to use this money for other things back in Britain. Obviously, they're imposing a lot of taxes on the merchants, which means they're going to continue making this money for as long as the slave trade is actually profitable. So, with that in mind, we're now going to think about each of these different areas, and you're going to use the map worksheet, which you can see a version of pictured here, to fill in some key details using the next couple of slides to help you. So you're going to need the worksheet, Benefits of the Slave Trade on Britain, and you're going to need to add some key bits of information to show how each of the different places on the map benefited in general from the slave trade. So use the next couple of slides to help you. There's a lot of information on them, but you're going to look to summarise some just key points in the boxes that you have. Okay, so key bits of information for your first box, which is going to be about London. So you're looking to just summarise this slide into your box about London. Don't write everything, we're going to summarise it. So because London was Britain's major port, ships owned by London merchants dominated the trade during the 17th and the early 18th centuries. Later on, London's position was challenged by Bristol and then ultimately by Liverpool as they developed and grew as well. The banking and insurance industry grew in London, which is possibly one of its biggest impacts. The City of London provided the money for quite a lot of slaving voyages. It was quite costly to set up a slaving voyage. You had to pay crew, you had to rent or buy a ship, you had to supply all the goods and things to trade with, so it did take a lot of money. And other London institutions would then insure the cargo and the plantation goods so that if they were damaged or lost, they would be replaced. So, summarising that last slide, you're looking just to put it into your own words and fill in your box. Your next box is going to be about Bristol, and there's some more information for this one. So Bristol is situated on the River Avon, which flows into the River Severn and then from that into the Bristol Channel before joining the Atlantic Ocean. So because of its connection to the rivers and then the easy access to the ocean, Bristol developed as another of the major trading ports in Britain. In Bristol, the real effect of the slave trade is in the wealth that it was actually created. The merchants profited from the sugar trade as the sugar grown on the European-owned plantations was shipped to Bristol first of all, which provided new industries and new markets within the city. Employment opportunities then skyrocketed. There was shipbuilding, sailmakers, chefs to service the ships and the crew, amongst lots of other things as well. It led to the growth of industry to support the expansion of trade. Bristol had a shipbuilding industry and a financial industry, as well as a network of merchants, so a merchants guild that's then developed, and the surrounding manufacturing industry produced goods to trade for the slaves in Africa, meant more jobs and things were created there, more factories were then opened because there was more goods being bought, so higher demand, and that led to more jobs and things as well. In terms of Liverpool, wealth definitely created in Liverpool. They earned £300,000 a year from the slave trade. Individual wealth and power for Liverpool. The slave merchants rose to positions of power and influence in the town. At least 26 of Liverpool's mayors between 1700 and 1820 were actually slave merchants. It led to a massive population growth within Liverpool. So in 1700, Liverpool was a small fishing port of about 5,000 people. 100 years later, that has grown to over 78,000 people who are living and working in Liverpool. Employment opportunities again, thousands of people found work because of the slave trade in places like the new cotton mills of Lanarkshire, which provided goods for trade for the slaves, shipbuilding, carpentry, rope making, sailors, banking, insurance, basically lots and lots of employment opportunities. Industry grew, the docks and the cotton mills were developed. Thomas Leyland's a good example. He was a slave merchant who entered the trade after he won £20,000 on a lottery, and he invested that money in ships for the slave trade. After about 20 years of this, he became a millionaire. He founded his own bank. He became Mayor of Liverpool 3 times, and he's a success story from this area that obviously was impacted very positively by the slave trade. Okay, so Glasgow then. There's quite a lot about Glasgow here. So when the trade routes between Europe and the Americas opened, so the West Indies opened, the River Clyde found itself really well positioned for trade in tobacco in particular. Because the journey from Glasgow to Virginia, which was in the USA, where quite a lot of the plantations that grew tobacco and things were, took about 20 days less than the journey from London to Virginia. So this 20-day advantage meant that almost half of the tobacco coming into Europe was distributed through Glasgow. The tobacco merchants, nicknamed the tobacco lords, like the sugar barons, provided the leaders of the colonies with commodities such as pottery, cloth and other essentials which were made in Glasgow, resulting in more jobs being created, in exchange for the tobacco, which they then sold to the rest of Britain and Europe, making huge profits for the city. In 1735, 67 ships sailed up the Clyde for destinations such as Virginia, Jamaica, places like this, for these crops. The Glasgow merchants were amongst the wealthiest in Europe at this point in time, lots and lots of money being made for what they were doing. Still in Glasgow, it created massive amount of wealth. So these are the key sort of bits that you need for your box. So wealth was created. They earned about 300,000 a year from the tobacco industry that was produced by slaves. Individual wealth and power was created. These tobacco lords became very wealthy. They bought really large estates and plantations in the Americas, and they employed Scottish immigrants in every position, from the estate and plantation managers to the slave drivers and the overseers. They then transported this tobacco back to Scotland, where it was sold on for huge profits, boosting the Scottish economy at this point in time. Industries grew, so shipbuilding and shipping developed really quickly, which is going to then become important later on when we're thinking about the First World War, because Glasgow becomes known as the second city of Europe because of its industrial development. Quite a lot of this financed because of its involvement in the slave trade. Good example is William Cunningham. He's a principal partner in a tobacco company, which was William Cunningham and Company. It grew to become one of Glasgow's largest importers of tobacco at this point in time. And like many wealthy Glasgow merchants, he then used his profits to build property, such as a mansion in Queen Street, which he built in 1778, which now is actually still there, but is now the Gallery of Modern Art today. So if you're in Glasgow and you are ever in the Gallery of Modern Art, you're standing in a slave merchant's building. Glasgow streets were also named after those involved in the slave trade, and locations such as Glasgow Street, Virginia Place, Jamaica Street, just as a couple of examples. So pause the video, go back, double check each of your cities, put it into your own words, summarise what the impact on these cities actually were in your map, and then we're going to write this slide as a little conclusion into your notes and into your jotter. So overall, the effects of the slave trade were the cities grew, Liverpool and Bristol being the main ones. Wealth was created as slave labour in the West Indies and the Americas meant the government income increased dramatically. Banks and finance houses grew rich. Individuals made huge fortunes and built large estates near the ports. Industry grew, so the Industrial Revolution was financed, which led to manufacturing developing, tobacco in places in Glasgow, cotton and cloth and things like that in Lanarkshire. Transport industry grew, so the docks were developed, warehouses were built to house the cargo, canals were built all the way across Britain from this money coming in from the trade to transport the goods more effectively. This led to other networks and things being developed in terms of transport. Banks and insurance companies grew to finance the voyages and insure the cargo, and buildings were built. This included hospitals, colleges, private homes like we've seen, and schools such as places like Dollar Academy, just as some examples. So pause this video, you're making a copy of this slide into your note as a conclusion under your map, and then move on to the next slide, which is a summary grid for the impact of the slave trade. So this is the summary grid. You can do this as a mind map, or if you've been doing it as grids, you can do it still as a grid, and we're just looking for key kind of facts. So we could say, for example, London had a monopoly on trading slaves in the UK. They did it first, so they made a lot of money. Still in London, provided financial services like loans to buy or rent a fully equipped ship and pay wages to captain and crew. Still in London, the merchants also needed insurance, which is the Lloyd's of London being set up, Barclays for the other ones for loans. There was an increase in the need for manufactured goods made in Britain, which were traded in Africa, which created jobs everywhere, so this one we need. The slave ships needed to employ a crew for the journey, so lots of jobs made, which created jobs everywhere. The British cotton mills relied on supplies of cheap cotton grown by slaves, which provided jobs turning it into cloth across the country in the British factories. In terms of Liverpool, Liverpool had become the largest slave ship building site in Britain, with 2/5 of British vessels being built there, creating huge numbers of jobs: carpenters, rope makers, dock workers. In Glasgow, we've got the merchants. Enormous fortunes resulted in many of Glasgow's finest buildings being built, like the Gallery of Modern Art today, which we said. Glasgow also had great profits from the trade in processing tobacco and sugar, which became a big part of Glasgow's economy. And in Bristol, Bristol became England's second wealthiest city through its involvement in the slave trade, and in particular sugar refining. So pause the video, finish your grid, make sure you've got these notes stuck in your jotter. Any questions that you have, ask your teacher, put a note in your team, and let us know how you're getting on.